This is the Sports and Society podcast, where we go beyond scores, statistics, and personalities to focus on issues and controversies in sports worlds. Your hosts, Jake Oakley and Jeff Montes de Oca, are sports sociologists and the authors of the book, Sports and Society, Issues and Controversies. The episodes in this podcast give you a behind-the-scenes look at the textbook with stories from our lives as scholars and athletes, as well as providing analysis of ongoing issues and controversies in contemporary sport worlds. We welcome hearing your thoughts and analysis, so please use this space to engage with us about the textbook or any of the topics we cover in this podcast. Hello and welcome to the 16th episode of the Sport and Society podcast. In this episode, we will discuss Chapter 15, Sports and Religion. Is it a promising combination? Your hosts are Jake Oakley and Jeff Montes de Oca. Good morning, Jay.
Good morning, Jeff. So this is an interesting topic we're dealing with today.
It is an interesting topic, and maybe that we can start there, and you can help me understand this a bit, because for people like myself, it isn't necessarily, it's not necessarily immediately apparent why we're talking about sports and religion. I mean, so just give you some background about me. My mom, she's a secular Jew, so not particularly religious. My father, because of his experience growing up in an American Indian boarding school, he had a very negative experience with Christianity there, and that made him a really militant atheist, actually kind of obnoxious at times. So I didn't grow up in a religious household. Now, I do know traditional sports were closely tied to religion. I mean, we could just think about the ancient Olympics, right? They were played at the foot of Mount Olympus to honor the gods, especially Zeus, right? Medieval European games were tied to the religious calendar. So days like Shrove Tuesday in Britain was a very important day for ball games. And I don't know about you, but I had to look up Shrove Tuesday. I had never heard of that till I started reading the histories. But it's the final day of Shrovetide, and it marks the end of pre-Lent. So I guess that's your last chance to have fun before Fat Tuesday or something like that. But modern sports, the contemporary sports that we know, they're secular, they're rational. We'd even say they're bureaucratic, right? I always think of Alan Gutman's, classic book, From Ritual to Record, the shift from sport being traditional and religious to modern and bureaucratic. Not only that, we're living in a time when fewer and fewer people globally are claiming a religious identity. And even in the United States, that's been on decline, which is pretty unusual in U.S. history because we're generally a very religious people. So I was hoping that from your own background, because you did grow up in a religious household, you can help people like me to understand why we're even talking about sport and religion.
Yeah, well, I was the oldest of 6 kids in an Irish Catholic family in Chicago at a time when Chicago was heavily ethnic, a lot of white ethnics, and we had ethnic neighborhoods and ethnic parishes within the diocese, the Archdiocese of Chicago. And as I went to Catholic elementary school, I decided that maybe becoming a priest was the thing for me. And I actually then enrolled in a seminary for high school in the middle of Chicago. So I met then all of these young people from these ethnic parishes from all over Chicago coming with their ethnic perspectives to the seminary and merging them together under this umbrella of Catholicism. And so Catholicism was kind of a unifying thing within the city, and it was integrated into urban Catholic schools. the sports were integrated into urban Catholic schools, is what I meant to say. And uh, and the reason that Catholic schools grabbed on to sports was that it did help pull people from different ethnic backgrounds together and gave them a shared activity. And it also, within the parishes themselves that ran sport programs, it also legitimized their Catholicism and their ethnicity within the greater Chicagoland area. So, they felt that they were accommodating to the existing Chicago culture and in general, and also assimilating in a sense. So basically, sport was used by Catholics to merge within the general social structure of the larger cultural and social context, and also within Catholicism generally. So it was a helpful tool.
So one of the things I'm hearing from you is you're seeing sport and religion, specifically Catholicism, in your life as similar institutions, as they're doing similar things. They're bringing people together across sectarian differences like ethnicity in this particular case, that they each have a unifying and integrating force, though they're each different, right? We would never confuse, I would never confuse Catholicism for basketball, right? Or vice versa.
Yeah.
So they're specific in their own ways, but they do many of the same things.
Right. And the same thing with Mormonism. And in the Mormon wards, sports are absolutely crucial to the interpersonal dynamics and the collective kind of identification that exists within Mormon wards. So there's some similarities between Mormonism and Catholicism there for sure.
So we also see, I don't know if we got into it too much in the episode on race and ethnicity, but we discuss it in the textbook, of course. We see some similar things in different racial communities. So for instance, the Indo-Pak games, that my friend Stan Thagaraj has written about quite a bit, that sport is really important. So if you think about the Indian and Pakistani communities, well, there could be large groups of Hindus and large groups of Muslims. And so across those sectarian differences, sport also is serving a really integrating function, but also not just integrating the two groups together, but integrating those two groups together into U.S. culture.
And that's been an important part of the whole sport-religion connection in the United States especially, but in many societies around the world now that are diverse in terms of people coming from different cultural backgrounds and different religious backgrounds in some cases.
Okay. So, and we'll get into some of that more in a little bit. But right now, I want to ask you about something else, which is talking about religion, particularly talking about religion sociologically, can be really challenging for a lot of people. And I think it's and it doesn't really matter if they're faithful or they're secular, because they can have very deeply held beliefs about religion. So like, my father has very deeply held beliefs about religion. They're all negative, but that doesn't mean they aren't deeply held, right? So maybe you could talk about how the tools of sociology allows us to discuss religion that's challenging for both religious and non-religious people alike.
Yeah, I think for the religious person, sociology puts religion into a social, cultural, and historical context that has informed and continues to inform religious doctrine and beliefs. So, it connects it with the context within which it exists. It connects religion with the social context. And in doing so, it makes it difficult for people to hold to the belief that their religion somehow transcends everyday realities and is firmly grounded in an unchanging, supernatural, and sacred realm unrelated to the material world. So that can be challenging for a religious person.
And that makes total sense, right? Because
Right.
as sociologists, we say religion is a social construction, and
Right.
that's contrary to faith.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So then it's confusing. Like, but what about secular folks like me? Like,
Yeah.
how does it challenge us?
The non-religious person, sociology provides concepts and theories and research methods that document and explain the power of religion in society and in everyday life and in the personal lives of the people who have faith. So faith in the absolute truth of their religious beliefs. So it helps you understand that kind of power and how it affects people's lives. But you come up with that explanation without having to commit to religious beliefs yourself. So because you do see them as you do see religious beliefs as social constructs, and so that's an important thing for the non-religious person, is to understand religion enough to realize its power. And I know that my granddaughters, who were raised not being religious, I introduced them to things related to religion so that they would start understanding the power of it among their friends who had religious faith, and without having to commit to that faith themselves, but to understand it and understand the power that it has, even among young people as they're growing up. So, and that's an important thing when you're living in a culture like the United States that's grounded in Judeo-Christian religious tradition.
I mean, I've found in my lifetime that as a Jewish person, it's very important to understand Christianity and Christians, because the United States is a Christian-dominated nation, and I realize I probably know more about Scripture than a lot of my students who are Christian. And but I was going to say, it's kind of funny. I was, your point about how sociology can challenge both the faithful and the secular people simultaneously. When I teach sociological theory, well, first I'm introducing students to Marx and Marx's take on religion, that religion is the opiate of the masses. And the secular students are all, that's right, it's, it tricks you. It's not real. It's, it's a bunch of hooey and make believe. Then we get to Emil Durkheim, and we talk about how religion is a social force in people's lives, helping them through difficult times, and in a lot of situations is the catalyst for political activism and resistance to domination. And then the religious students in the class, they start cheering. It's pretty hilarious looking at that. But both can happen simultaneously.
Exactly. And that is prime research territory for the sociologist, because for us sociologists, these two ways of conceptualizing religion are not really contradictory. They're the opposite sides of the same coin. And we view them as the reality of institutionalized religions across various countries and around the world. So I think bringing those two approaches together gives you a really good, full understanding of what religion means within society and how it can be connected with sport in a variety of different ways. So,
Yeah. So I want to change gears a little bit, but still with these framing questions. So going to the beginning of the chapter, we place the general decline of worldwide religiosity against the increasing popularity of sports, and then we ask if sports are our new religion, which, that's an intentionally provocative question. But I think the real question for us as sociologists is, how does religion get defined? Now, our mutual friend Jeff Scholes, who's a religious studies scholar, says, "Oh, you can't define religion. You can't. The desire to define religion is colonial, and that might be true if you're a philosopher. But I think as sociologists, we do want to define religion, but we want to define it based on how people actually use it, how people in social worlds are defining religion. So can you talk for a little bit about the different ways that people tend to view sport and religion?
well, one of the things that I first came across was the notion and you mentioned this, that sport is religion, and not just religion-like, that it is serving the same functions as religion, that it's integrated into people's lives in a similar way that religion is integrated into people's lives. It gives people meaning. It provides a unique collective emotional experience for people that temporarily separates them from the everyday reality of their lives. And Emil Durkheim, as you've pointed out, talked about collective effervescence. The energy that's generated by large groups of people engaged in a shared activity. So when you go and sit with 60,000 people at a football game, some of the emotional unity that's generated there, that collective effervescence, is very similar to what might happen at a religious service. And so that's one of the things that has led people to see sport as a religion.
You know, one of the things I'll do in the classroom when teaching Durkheim is I'll have the students do the wave. And it becomes, even a classroom, it becomes really powerful once people are standing up and putting their hands up in the air and that wave is rolling through that space. It's the spirit moves you.
Yeah. And by the way, go to any religious service and there are similar kinds of rituals that exist that do the same thing. So, as a young Catholic, the blessing that the priest gives the congregation, you all bless yourself. You're all doing it in unison. And then at another point during the Catholic Mass, you confirm your connection with the other believers by shaking their hand, acknowledging that they exist and that they're part of the same congregation as you. So basically, those kinds of rituals are very affirming to not just us as people, but as people with particular belief systems. And then, the other approach is that religion and sport are inherently different. Religion is basically a sacred and supernatural institution and activity, and that it transcends everyday life, the here and now, and it transcends cultural contexts and forms of social organization. And then on the other hand, sports are secular. They don't transcend anything in everyday life. They're activities that have secular goals, secular cultures, secular meanings. They don't have anything to do with this directly with the supernatural or sacred realm. So they are inherently different. You can't compare a church to a sport venue because one has a set of meanings grounded in the sacred and supernatural realm, and the other has a set of meaning grounded in a secular realm.
And it seems to me that very different groups of people could be taking this position on religion and sport, right? The people that don't want religion being profaned by popular culture, by commercialism, the commercialism of popular culture, as we've discussed repeatedly about sport.
Yeah.
At the same time, you could have other people who are coming from a more secular perspective and just, are separation of church and state. These are two very different things. We don't blend them. We don't confuse one for the other. I mean, I could see, really different groups of people having the same operating definition and organizing their lives and their actions around those definitions, even if they're that same definition, even if they're coming from really different places.
Right. And by the way, there's been Supreme Court decisions on that when coaches lead their team in prayer, in a public school setting. And coaches have been reprimanded there because it puts pressure on students coming from different religious perspectives or no religious perspective to join in, or else they're going to be marginalized. So that has been a recurring legal issue for the past 50 years. So that religion and sport, are they different or not? And how do we separate them in everyday life? So now sociologists, see sport as a cultural practice, a social construction, and there's some similarities with religion, but there's similarities between every major social institutions. They're basically rule and norm govern activities created by people as they interact together and come to some kind of a consensus of how their lives should be organized in particular settings. And sport is one of those settings. So, in a sense, sports are organized around the consensus that's developed as people interact with one another and come to agreement on what sports should mean in their lives.
Fantastic. So now I want to switch gears again. I want to get into more of our specific content questions. And as you know, Jay, historically, Christianity was very distrustful of sports. But that shifted in the 18th and especially the 19th century with the rise of muscular Christianity. In the chapter, we draw on historical research to argue that the Gaines ethic of muscular Christianity brought the church and school together in service of empire by sanctioning white supremacy. Can you talk about what that means and that particular, what does it mean within that history of the rise of muscular Christianity in the British Empire?
Yeah, and this is a pretty complicated issue if people haven't thought about it before. And you've got to know a little bit about some of the history of Christian beliefs and how they're applied in everyday life. And like you say, prior to the 18th century, the focus of Christian beliefs was basically on the soul, on saving your soul. It was not on the body. In fact, the body was defined as material and temporary and a source of temptation and sinfulness. And so you had to control the body for the sake of your eternal soul. So getting involved in sports was not something that was defined as approvable within that kind of a belief system. So in today's terms, we might say that the body was the source of material pleasure, indulgence, and fun, none of which were going to get you to heaven. So, so, so sport was not seen in a favorable way. But in Great Britain, as boys and men became more sedentary and in certain ways more feminized, in the sense that they were no longer being prepared to fight and protect their family and nation, it was concluded by some Christians that there was a need for people to express spirituality through morally informed physical action and good deeds in the name of their God. So in the process, the body started to be seen as God's tool, and therefore it should be developed and maintained to do God's work, which often required a physical effort. So over the years, there was that merger between the body and doing God's work. And that was a very major change. And it gave rise to this notion of muscular Christianity, which accentuated that connection.
How does muscular Christianity and the focus on sport fit into the British boarding schools? And I think it's important also for historical context that these were elite academies where children of the aristocracy and the ruling capitalist classes sent their children, and those children were being raised to lead the empire. And so sport was such an important part then in the 18th, but again, especially the 19th century, as a tool of socialization for these boys to grow up and take on various different roles, whether they were in the military, in business, or in the clergy.
Right. And as noted in the chapter, the saying back then was that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the plain fields of Eton. And that's exactly what you're getting at there, where the development of the character and the physical attributes that occurs within a sport context was basically the kind of thing that separated those elite white boys and young men from the rest of British society. And like you say, they then used those attributes to become leaders within the society. And the same thing happened at a little later date in the United States as muscular Christianity emerged in connection with what we call the Protestant work ethic, the Protestant ethic generally, that emphasized values that were inherent within a Christian belief system. And that Protestant ethic served as a basis for success within a capitalist system and eventual emergence into leadership roles, which again was something that intersected with race in some interesting ways. It like you say, it reaffirmed this notion of white supremacy, because it was the white students who were exposed to this kind of training, and the connection between sport and success and leadership, and it separated them from their peers within society and reaffirmed the notion of white supremacy as they took over leadership roles and played in power positions within the society.
And the way I think about this is that there was a practical aspect to this. And we think about like the games that the boys were playing in the boarding school. Take rugby, for instance. it's physically strenuous. You build endurance, strength. You build, as we talked about with the episode on violence in sport, right? You build a resilience to pain and overcome fear, all of those sorts of things, right? And you think about like
Right.
how disciplined rugby is. Well, that's a
Right.
discipline that's needed on the battlefield, right? That's
Right.
why Waterloo was won through the friendly strife on the fields of Eton. But it was more than just that. There was also a moral education going on there,
Right.
right? That disciplining of the body, right? Think about the YMCA, classic institution of muscular Christianity, Young Men's Christian Association, mind, body, spirit, right? You're not just disciplining your body, you're disciplining your mind and your spirit. And this is crucial because, again, within the British Empire, this is about spreading civilization throughout the world, spreading civilization to the light of civilization to the dark corners of the world. And so this is a moral endeavor. And so the conquest of people, the killing of people, the burning their homes, the taking of their land becomes a moral endeavor. And I think that's where it's like, it's so important when we think about how does religion and sport help to sanctify white supremacy. I mean, it becomes so clear when we look at how they worked within the empire. And just to revisit something that you talked about in a previous episode, which is the birth of the modern Olympics with Baron Pierre de Coubertin. After the Franco-Prussian War that France lost, Pierre de Coubertin, he's looking around and saying, boy, the French aristocracy has lost its way. We've become soft in modern society, right? The same thing people were saying in Britain and the United States. And he looked across the channel to the sporting English gentleman and said, that's the model that we need to adopt. And that's what led him, as of course you know this, Jay, to start the modern Olympic movement that really adopted British imperial sports. And that now is our definition of sport generally. I mean, obviously, you and I, as sociologists, are going to define sport more broadly, but generally speaking, for people in the 21st century, those 18th, 19th century British boarding school games are what we call sport.
Yeah. And let me just give you a Catholic slant on that. The whole notion of pain and suffering as being something that enables you to, like you say, discipline your mind and your body. So as I was growing up, whenever things got tough in terms of pain and suffering, my parents used to say, offer it up for the poor souls in purgatory. And that then allowed me to claim moral worth, and on the basis of that claim, seek leadership roles, because I was worthy of assuming such roles because I had saved the poor souls in purgatory. So it was an interesting kind of dynamic that I would hear in Catholic social settings all the time. When times get rough, offer it up. Tie it to something that's morally worthy that will give you a claim to personal moral worth.
That's so funny that you would tell that story, because now I understand. I don't know if you remember, but several years ago, you gave me a hard time once because I said I don't take aspirin or other pain relievers when I'm in pain, and that was the framing you gave me for why I don't. And I will agree that because of my sport training, because I played I played football, rugby, and then I boxed for years. Pain is just part and parcel of it, and the ability to endure pain is within that space, not just a disciplining, but a moral good.
Right.
And it is good to be able to endure pain, and oftentimes it's unnecessary
Yeah.
enduring pain unnecessarily, and also with long-term health consequences.
Yeah. And by the way, when you said that, I pictured my mom and dad who said the same exact thing. I'm not going to take aspirin. I'm not going to take Advil or, ibuprofen, because pain is good. Pain increases my strength and my moral worth. So
I transcend this plane, right? I transcend the pain and get to
yeah.
the next level. So I'm going to change gears again a little bit, actually a lot this time. And so one of the things, Jay, that sociology is really good at is that it's dispelling stereotypes. And I think this is very important for our discussion today, because one religion currently that faces tremendous stereotypes and with devastating consequences is Islam. And one stereotype, and it's been used to justify attacks upon Muslim nations, is that Islam is sexist, it represses women's freedoms, and sport has been used as an example of this in a variety of different ways. So maybe you could talk about what are some of the ways in which this particular stereotype operates. This, how Islam is patriarchal and repressive, and we see it operating in sports.
And yeah, it leads to this notion that there is this, I guess we could call binary between Muslims and Christians, and that on the one hand, Muslims are viewed as being less civilized, that they have an approach towards gender that is oppressive and patriarchal, and that Muslim men are basically to be feared because they're stereotyped as terrorists, and they're also stereotyped as using their Muslim beliefs to justify their terrorism, and in the process, Muslim women are reduced to passive victims of patriarchy, and they end up being oppressed by and obedient to Muslim men. So those are the stereotypes. And if you start studying the way the Muslim religion is practiced in different cultures around the world, you start seeing that those practices are as diverse as the diversity that exists among Christians in societies where Christianity is the dominant religious belief system. So, what we've done is we've characterized all Muslim men and women in terms of stereotypes rather than looking at their lived experiences. And we don't have chances to learn from their lived experiences if they're segregated from us in everyday life, if they're discriminated against, and if they're oppressed in any way. So there is a built-in separation that prevents us from learning about lived experiences. And that then reaffirms and reproduces stereotypes.
Yeah, I think one of the things I think that's very important to recognize here, and I actually want to give a huge shout out to my good friend Umar Hussein, who has done tremendous research on Muslim athletes and sports in Muslim nations, and had a long conversation with me when we were working on the chapter. I think one of the things we'll just use the term Western nations, which is a little bit of a simplification, but we'll use that term anyway because it's familiar. So for those of us in Western nations, we hear a tremendous amount about Islam and Muslims, and a lot of it is tremendously stereotypical, which is to say every stereotype has a kernel of truth. or as one of my professors in grad school used to say, stereotypes are statistical inaccuracies. There are cases where they're true, but then you generalize a subset of a population to the entire population, and then it becomes a stereotype. And so we have this image of Islam and Muslims, as you said, Jay, as monolithic. One nation ends up representing all Muslims. And maybe it's Saudi Arabia, maybe it's Iran. They become this representation of all Muslims. And specific Muslims become representations of all Muslims. But of course, there's tremendous diversity. Islam is a giant religion spread around the entire world. I mean, you've got religious Muslim nations, you have secular, so like Saudi Arabia and Iran, both religious, conservative religious Muslim nations. But then you have secular Muslim nations. Turkey comes to mind. But then you have tremendous numbers of Muslims in non-Muslim nations, right? What we call Western nations. You think about the spread of Islam across North Africa, the Middle East, into Asia. There's Indonesia is an Asian nation, and it's got the largest Muslim population in the whole world. And so there's actually tremendous diversity, but a subset ends up representing the whole, and that is by definition a stereotype. And so then it becomes really easy to, as you said, view Muslim women as passive and the West then as liberating. But of course, that line reproduces its own critique. It makes Muslim women really passive and doesn't recognize their agency, doesn't allow for any space for agency. And there's a name for all of this. Yeah. And we talk about it in the Focus on Sports box, and it's called Orientalism. And we define it in the chapter as a colonial ideology or belief system that divides the world into an East-West binary, that defines the West as civilized, rational, progressive, and liberating, whereas the East is savage, irrational, archaic, and oppressive. So, Jay, I was hoping you could talk a bit more about how Orientalism might operate in sports spaces and the impact it can have on Muslim communities, both in Muslim nations and in Western nations.
Yeah, that again is a question that requires some knowledge of the lived experience of Muslims. And I'm just going to give you a quick example because in my personal experience, as growing up, I had no connection with Muslims. And in 1994, I participated in the Brighton Conference in Brighton, England, which was the first conference ever to bring women from around the world, 186 women from over 70 countries together to talk about women in sport and how sport could become more open for women. And Muslim women were at that conference. And I was the only man leading a seminar at that conference. And it was how to deal with men in sport organizations. And one of the sessions I had was with 10 Muslim women in their hijabs and coming in, and I asked a few questions, and all of a sudden the Muslim women took off talking about their personal experiences. And I learned all sorts of things that I didn't know about how Muslim women were using Muslim belief systems to manage their lives within sports and to empower them within sport settings, all female sport settings. And so they even talked about the power of the hijab, where they could do this without getting hassled because their bodies were covered. And men might hassle them for other reasons, but it isn't for the same reasons that women are getting hassled in Christian societies. So they basically saw an advantage to their Muslim beliefs and their involvement in sports. So that opened my eyes, and I have seen examples of it ever since 1994. So, and we won't get into that right now, but Muslim women are participating in sport to a much greater extent than they had 50 or 60 years ago. And it's because they're in many ways learning to play sport in these settings where they are empowered as women.
Yeah, and that's such an important point that you're making. And one of the things I found, we were talking about this earlier, but one of the things I found really fascinating in an ethnography on Egyptian women athletes, Muslim women in Egypt who are athletes, and it was looking at athletes who were more religious to less to secular. And one of the things that one of the things the researchers found is that the women that were secular were more likely to ask for a man's permission, whether it was their father or a partner, to participate in sport. Whereas the very religious women were like, I'm not going to ask a man for permission to participate in sports. The only person, only God can tell me what to do with my body. So if a man thinks he can tell me what to do with my body, then he's thinking he's God. And that's unacceptable, right? And so what in the quote unquote West, what we would call the more liberal and liberated view was held by the women who were more conservatively religious, because that's the way that they're interpreting their religion and their culture, right? And there's a logic to this. There's a cultural logic going on here. And just to add one more thing, Islam has supported women's participation in sport for far longer than Christianity has. The way that some Muslim religious scholars interpret the hadiths, and these are the stories that were told from the time of the Prophet Muhammad and about his life, there are hadiths that support women's participation in sport. And Christianity, until, as we already talked about, till fairly recently, didn't even want men participating
Right.
in sport. And so there was a much more open embrace of sport as a way of maintaining one's health in Islam, long before Christianity. And so when we understand this, then these stereotypes that say, oh, the East is always archaic, they're always backwards, they need us to liberate them, and that justifies our intervention, our military interventions in their nations. We can see again how sport and religion are wound up in the operation of empire, or they certainly can be in many situations.
Right. Yeah. By the way, when U.S. troops went into Afghanistan, I heard so many people say, "Well, it's to save the girls and women," and I was thinking, "Well, where were you when the girls and women in the United States who wanted to play sport needed to be saved?" And so that was an interesting kind of contradiction that is tied to this notion of Orientalism.
That's right. So, and it's a very powerful concept that describes so much of what, particularly, we in Western nations are subjected to. You see it in movies, television shows, books you read, documentaries, the news, and we can see it in the way that sports are talked about. And again, it is particular cases, which is not to say the cases aren't true, because they can be factually true, but when these particular cases come to stand in and represent the whole, that's when they become very distorting. And and it also helps prepare people to accept, and I should say citizens in countries like the United States, to accept a very activist military intervention in other parts of the world. And those interventions are usually serving interests other than saving the girls.
Right. For sure. And we're seeing that right now in terms of conflicts around the world.
That's right.
So,
Great. I want to shift gears one more time because we've got, again, lots of territory to cover. And I want to go back to our good friend Jeff Scholes, because he outlines a whole series of different ways that people engage in religious expressions during sporting events. And one of the things about his typology is the way in which it demonstrates the operation of theology in everyday life. Can you talk about, for a little bit, why people might want to engage in religious expressions in these various different ways, as Jeff Scholes outlines?
yeah, I think, well, yeah, Jeff has a really nice framework, and he devises expressions into expressions that communicate little to no intervention by God, and then interventions that communicate that God intervenes in sports. And we've seen a lot of the former in post-game interviews that we see after NBA games, after NFL games, and occasionally after soccer games. So one of those expressions is it's just a game, that it diminishes, that expression diminishes the overall significance of sport, and it elevates a God that doesn't care about the outcome of sporting events. It lifts God above the competition and basically safeguards divine impassibility, which is basically that God cannot be criticized or critiqued in terms of what's going on in everyday life. So by lifting God above the fray, that's one of the consequences. So basically, when people say it's just a game from a religious perspective, they're minimizing the importance of sports in reference to something larger, like human suffering or God's will, since it's just a game. So that's one of the expressions. So another one is billboarding, and we see a lot of that. From our experience, we used to see in the stands all the time the John 3:16 sign, especially in the end zone where the cameras would pan in all the time. And that Bible has been very popular in sports in a number of ways. And when you look, by the way, when that first came out, there were more searches, online searches for John 3:16 than any other search term used. And basically that verse in the Bible said, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." And from a spectator's perspective, John 3:16 united not just the spectators and the team under this notion that we all believe together here, but it also united the athletes with each other. So athletes started putting 3:16 on their uniform, on their undereye liner, and other parts of their physical being. So it was an expression that Jeff calls that Jeff Scholes calls billboarding. So, and it's basically a vague presentation and gesture that leaves the meaning to the audience to interpret. And we see it when an athlete points to the sky. makes the sign of the cross, kneels down, genuflects. As a Catholic growing up, I saw billboarding all over the place. Before shooting a free throw, somebody would make the sign of the cross, in the Catholic schools competitions that I participated in. And I remember one game where I was standing on the rebounding lines for a free throw, and my opponent made the sign of the cross from the free throw line, and I leaned over the line and looked right at him and made the sign of the cross back, just to let him know that God wasn't going to be solely on his side. And so I was billboarding in reverse, and I don't know if it shook him up, but he only made one of the two free throws. But anyway, those are the kinds of gestures that we're talking about, and we see that regularly in sport. And then there's glorification statements that basically, I do it all for the glory of God. I was great out there, but it's not me. I have dedicated myself and my sport life to giving glory to God, and God deserves the credit here, not me. And we see that when people make some kind of a verbal statement about their own religious beliefs and their success in sport.
So, I have a question there, because this is something I always reflect upon. I'm not a Christian, so and you're my native informant now, Jay. So, as I understand it, in Christianity, pride is seen as very dangerous, right? It's
Right.
what leads to the fall, as I understand it. But athletes, and even Christian athletes, are oftentimes filled with pride. And so there seems to be a tension there between the way in which sport will encourage prideful thoughts, prideful behaviors, but for a Christian, that's potentially very dangerous. Would you say this is a way that of negotiating that tension between the way in which sports fosters pride and a Christian discomfort with pride?
Yeah, and that's a good point, because the athletes know that, and so pridefulness is equated with sinfulness, and if you use your success to glorify God, then that leads you to escape that tension, and we see that all the time in terms of some of the things that Christian athletes will say in a post-game interview. So, or when they're talking about their religion, just in general, with a group of people, apart from a sport context, they'll attribute their success to God and not tie it to pride, but tie it to the fact that they're doing God's work and glorifying God in the process.
I think that Jeff Scholes' distinction between soft providence and hard providence is really interesting. And soft providence is a more understated way of imagining God's relationship to sporting events, right? This idea that God is there, God is watching over, and if nothing bad happens, then no one gets injured, right? It demonstrates God's providence. As opposed to that, hard providence is this idea that God cares about the outcome of the sporting event.
Right.
That this is a very interventionist God who, like as in your example, did God help that kid make his one free throw, or was God there blocking the second free throw?
Right.
And I'm laughing as I say this, but but that's important for Scholes, right?
Yeah,
That one is understated, and one is a very very strong statement, because these things take on racialized connotations.
right. And basically, we don't hear expressions of hard providence very often, uh, because we live in a secular society, and if you start talking about God directly intervening in the outcomes of a sport event in a secular society, you're going to run into trouble. You're going to run into resistance and backlash, and you're upsetting the whole set of things that attract people to sport. It's the uncertainty. It's the ability to perform, to have humans perform in a way that leads to success. So you, even if somebody believes in a hard providence approach, they're going to keep that private for the most part, uh, and they'll pray for a victory before a game for sure, uh, and they'll pray for a comeback at halftime. But we hear expressions of soft providence all the time, that God watches over the activities in which we engage. And basically, we would like to have those activities contribute to the overall development of human beings who collectively can give glory to God. So, and if injuries occur during a game, it's because of the nature of the game, not because of the orientations of the religious individuals, that's a tricky one. So, because I've heard Christian athletes say that, I'm going to exercise my religiosity by hitting you as hard as I can with all the strength and the power that the good Lord has given to me. And, if I'm the opponent and I'm religious, I'm really worried about that one. So, but people have to be careful about those kinds of statements as well. So they will just attribute injuries to the nature of the game and separate it from any kind of religious content or approach to the game.
One of the things I think that's really interesting about this hard and soft providentialism for Jeff Scholes is these are really good examples of how we see theology operating in popular culture and in everyday life, because what he's trying to show in, if anyone gets around to reading that book that we've drawn from, is it reflects how white Protestant theology develops in a white supremacist nation versus how Black Protestant theology develops in a white supremacist nation. And one of the things that the soft providentialism does is it supports the status quo as it exists, that the world is organized the way it should be, things work out well, that this is God's design. As opposed to that, Black ideology recognizes there are tremendous inequalities in the world that we live in, and so it imagines an activist judge. Excuse me, there's a Freudian slip. An activist God intervening on the side of justice, and that's where that hard providentialism comes from. It's this idea that God will set things right, that God will engage in these sporting contests, because these sporting contests have profound impacts on people's lives. If you're coming from, which is the case for a lot of, say, NFL football players, NBA basketball players, if you're coming from a poor community of color, that the outcome of that game has a profound impact on your life and your financial chances. And there's a tremendous amount of, and this is Jeff's argument, psychic stress. A simple injury could end a career, and injuries happen all the time, right? A poor call by an official, a biased call by a racist official can have a profound impact upon a person's life. And so there's a theology that allows for the calling upon of supernatural forces to intervene in the temporal world on the side of justice to make the right outcome happen. And so Jeff outlines cases where you do see, a black athlete like Reggie White, one of the all-time great defensive linemen in the NFL, making statements of hard providentialism and then being laughed at for it, for the reasons that you explained, Jay, but that also reflects the assumptions, the norms of a white-dominated society are the norms of soft providentialism. So these hard providential statements, right? These sorts of religious statements seem out of place and laughable, which again reinforces the norms of soft providentialism.
Yeah, in a way. But, when you think about this in more general terms, you can think about Martin Luther King and the extent to which ministers were involved in the civil rights movement, which basically reaffirms what you're saying here, that after dealing with a history of injustice, that God will intervene in a way to bring justice. And the minister epitomized that, embodied that basically, and became the leader of the civil rights movement in the form of Martin Luther King. So it has implications that go beyond just sports.
Absolutely. It's funny you should bring up Martin Luther King because one of my sons is taking English 101 right now, and he had to write an essay on the letter from Birmingham, where Martin Luther King feels so betrayed by the liberal white clergy for not supporting their protests, and saying, as a Christian, this is what we have to do. This is a moral action that we have to engage in.
Yeah, and as an athlete in Catholic schools, I was told by a priest coach that we pray before a game that God's will be done. We don't pray for a win.
Yeah.
So, and that was a classic example of the soft providentialism.
That's right. Well, Jay, we better wrap things up there because we are at our time. So this is another, I think, a great episode. I hope that our listeners agree with that. In our next episode, it'll be the last one of the first season. We'll be discussing Chapter 16, Sports in the Future. What do we want them to be? And that is a great question. What do we want them to be, Jay?
And the future is forever. So we got to narrow it down a little bit. So
now you're getting religious on me again.
So we will have fun talking about that because we create the future. And to get away from the religion for a sec, and how we create it depends on the collective experiences that we have and how we give meaning to those experiences and the implications of those meanings for how we organize our lives in general, but sports in particular. So that is a great one because we are living in the midst of all sorts of, some people say, disruptive changes within sport. Where are sports going? And we'll have a chance to talk about that next week.